My crush pretended to like me back, then laughed in my face. 6 months later, he was begging me to give him a chance. I liked Nico for almost 2 years before I worked up the courage to tell him. We were in the same friend group all through junior and senior year of high school. He was funny and charming and had this way of making everyone feel like they were the most interesting person in the room. When he talked to me, I felt special. When he remembered small details about my life, I thought it meant something. When he started texting me more often, asking to hang out just the two of us, I convinced myself he felt the same way. I was 17 and stupid and believed what I wanted to believe. I told him at a party the summer after graduation, pulled him aside, hands shaking, heart pounding, and said I'd liked him for a long time and wondered if he might feel the same way. He smiled, said he'd been waiting for me to say something, said he liked me too and had for months, said he didn't want to ruin our friendship by making the first move, but he was so happy I'd been brave enough to do it. I could barely breathe. This was everything I'd wanted. He asked if he could kiss me. I said yes. It was my first kiss, and for about 30 seconds, it was perfect. Then I heard the laughter. His friends were standing at the back door watching us. One of them was bent over laughing so hard he could barely stand. Another was slow clapping. Nico pulled away from me with this grin on his face that I'll never forget. He turned to his friends and said, I told you she'd fall for it. They'd made a bet. Someone had dared Nico to get me to confess my feelings, pretend to reciprocate, and kiss me while everyone watched. The whole thing was a game. I was the punchline. I don't remember leaving the party. I just remember being in my car, crying so hard I couldn't see the road, pulling over in a parking lot and sitting there for an hour until I could breathe again. That was the worst night of my life. The story spread through our entire friend group within days. People I'd known for years were laughing about it behind my back, some to my face. I spent the rest of the summer hiding in my room, dreading college, wondering if I'd ever trust anyone again. Then I went to university 4 hours away and decided to become someone new. I threw myself into everything. Joined clubs, made friends, studied hard, worked out, learned how to dress in ways that made me feel confident. I stopped being the quiet girl who faded into the background. I became someone who walked into rooms and got noticed. It wasn't about Nico anymore. It was about proving to myself that I was worth more than a cruel joke at a party. By junior year, I'd changed completely. I had a strong group of friends, a good GPA, and more confidence than I'd ever had in my life. I dated a few people, nothing serious, but enough to know that I was capable of being wanted for real. I barely thought about high school anymore. Then Nico showed up at my college. He'd transferred after flunking out of his first school and getting rejected from his second choice. Our university was his backup plan. I saw him at a campus coffee shop during the first week of fall semester. He recognized me immediately, but it took him a moment to process what he was seeing. I could tell by the way his expression shifted from recognition to confusion to something I'd never seen on his face before: interest. He came over to my table and said he almost didn't recognize me. Said I looked amazing. Said it was crazy running into me here after all this time. He acted like we were old friends reconnecting. Like he hadn't humiliated me in front of everyone we knew. Like that kiss hadn't been the cruelest thing anyone had ever done to me. I smiled and kept the conversation short. Said it was nice to see him and I had to get to class. Didn't give him my number when he asked. Didn't agree to hang out when he suggested it. Just walked away and left him standing there looking confused. Over the next few months, Nico kept finding ways to run into me. Showed up at parties I was at. Sat near me in the library. Joined a club I was in, even though he had zero interest in the actual activities. He started texting me through mutual friends who'd give him my number without asking me first. Always casual, always friendly, always with an undertone of something more. I never took the bait. I was polite, but distant. Responded to texts hours later with one-word answers. Declined every invitation to hang out. Never explained why. Never brought up what happened, just kept him at arm's length while he tried harder and harder to get close. It drove him crazy. I started noticing him everywhere the following week. Tuesday morning, I walked into the library's second-floor study area, where I always worked between classes, and there he was at a table 3 rows back. He looked up from his laptop, caught my eye, and waved. I nodded back and chose a seat on the opposite side of the room. Wednesday afternoon, I stopped at the campus coffee shop where I went every day at 2:30 for an iced latte before my 3 o'clock lecture. Nico was in line ahead of me. He turned around when I walked in, smiled like running into me was the best surprise, and asked what I was ordering. I told him and moved past to grab a table while I waited. He brought both our drinks over and tried to sit down. I thanked him for the coffee, said I had reading to finish before class, and put in my earbuds. Thursday evening, I attended the weekly meeting for the environmental club I'd joined sophomore year. Nico walked in 15 minutes late, looked around the room, and took the empty chair directly across from me. He'd never shown interest in environmental issues before. During the break, Leilani leaned over and whispered that this was getting weird. She asked if I wanted her to tell him to back off. I shook my head and said I could handle it. Friday morning, he appeared at the campus gym during my usual workout time. I saw him on the treadmill watching me in the mirror while I did squats. He wasn't even running, just walking slowly and staring. I finished my set, grabbed my water bottle, and left 20 minutes earlier than normal. Saturday afternoon, my phone buzzed with a text from a number I didn't recognize. It was Nico saying he got my number from someone in our friend group and hoped that was okay. He mentioned he'd been thinking it would be good to catch up properly since we were both here now. He suggested coffee sometime, said he felt bad about how we'd lost touch after graduation. I stared at the message for a long time. Part of me wanted to ignore it completely. Another part was curious what he could possibly say about what happened. I texted back 2 hours later and said sure. Coffee sounded fine. We made plans to meet Monday after my morning classes at the cafe on the south end of campus. Monday came and I almost didn't go. I stood outside the cafe for 3 minutes debating whether to walk away. But I'd already agreed and I wanted to see if he would actually acknowledge what he'd done or just pretend it never happened. I pushed open the door and found him already there at a corner table with 2 drinks in front of him. He stood up when he saw me, smiling that same charming smile that used to make my heart race. Now it just made me tired. He said he'd ordered for me, remembered I liked vanilla lattes. I sat down and thanked him. He started talking immediately about his classes, his new apartment off campus, how different college was from what he'd expected. He asked about my major and seemed genuinely interested when I told him about the research project I was working on. He complimented my hair, said he loved the new style. He mentioned a party coming up that weekend and suggested we should go together. I kept my answers short and pleasant, told him about my classes in basic terms, said my research was going well, thanked him for the compliments without elaborating, declined the party invitation by saying I already had plans. I watched him work harder with each passing minute, trying different topics and angles to get me engaged in real conversation. He never once mentioned high school beyond vague references to our friend group, never brought up the party that summer, never acknowledged the bet or the kiss or the laughter. He acted like our last interaction had been some normal goodbye before we headed off to different schools, like we were old friends who'd simply drifted apart and now had a chance to reconnect. After an hour of this careful small talk, Nico leaned forward and his expression shifted to something more serious. He said he'd been thinking about me a lot since seeing me again on campus. He admitted he'd always wondered what might have happened if we'd stayed in touch after graduation. He said he'd love to hang out more now that we were at the same school, maybe make up for lost time. I smiled and told him that sounded nice, keeping my voice friendly but offering nothing concrete. I glanced at my phone and said I needed to get to class. He asked for my schedule so we could coordinate better. I stood up and said I'd text him sometime. I walked out before he could suggest anything else. Leilani was waiting in our apartment when I got back. She'd finished her classes early and made tea for both of us. She asked how the coffee went before I'd even put my bag down. I sat on the couch and told her it went exactly how I'd expected. Nico had spent the entire hour pretending the past didn't exist while testing whether I was still interested in him. He'd complimented me, acted fascinated by my life, suggested future plans, all without once acknowledging why we'd stopped talking in the first place. Leilani asked what I was planning to do about it. I realized as I said it out loud that I didn't actually need to do anything except keep living my life the way I had been. His complete inability to acknowledge what he'd done told me everything I needed to know about whether he'd really changed. I didn't need to confront him or explain or give him chances. I just needed to continue being polite and distant until he figured it out himself. The text started the next day. Nico sent me a meme about our shared biology class, then an invitation to a concert happening on campus, then a question about the homework assignment for the class we apparently both had on Thursdays. I responded hours later with brief, helpful answers. Never flirty, never encouraging, just pleasant enough that he couldn't call me rude, but distant enough that he couldn't mistake it for interest. The texts kept coming over the following days. More memes, more event invitations, more homework questions. I could feel his frustration building in the increasing frequency and the slightly more desperate tone. He had nothing to work with because I wasn't giving him anything. I wasn't angry enough to fight with or interested enough to pursue. I was just politely, consistently unavailable in every way that mattered. Saturday night, Leilani dragged me to a party at a house just off campus. I hadn't planned to go, but she insisted I needed to get out and have fun instead of spending another weekend studying. The house was packed with people from various friend groups and classes. I was getting a drink in the kitchen when someone tapped my shoulder. I turned around and found myself face to face with Johnny Kemp. He'd been one of Nico's closest friends in high school, one of the guys standing at the back door that night watching and laughing. My stomach tightened, but I kept my expression neutral. Johnny asked if he could talk to me for a minute. I followed him to a quieter corner of the living room. He said he'd been wanting to apologize for what happened at that party senior year. He told me he was an immature jerk back then, and he was genuinely sorry for laughing and being part of something so cruel. I studied his face and saw real guilt there. I told him I appreciated the apology and that I'd moved on from it. He seemed relieved, and we ended up talking for 20 minutes about how much we'd both changed since high school. He mentioned he'd cut back on drinking and was taking school seriously now. I told him about my research and my plans for graduate school. It was strange but good to see that people could actually grow. Before he left to find his friends, Johnny said something that stuck with me. He mentioned that Nico talked about me constantly these days, always trying to figure out why I was being so distant with him. Johnny said Nico seemed genuinely confused about why I wouldn't give him a real chance, like he couldn't understand that his past behavior might have actual consequences. I thanked Johnny for the information but didn't elaborate on my plans or feelings. I kept my cards close and changed the subject. We said goodbye, and I went to find Leilani. Monday, after my engineering study group, Rocco Bowman walked me back toward my apartment building. We'd been casually seeing each other for about a month. Nothing serious, but nice and easy and comfortable. He was smart and kind and treated me like I mattered. Halfway across campus, he asked if there was history between me and the guy who kept showing up wherever I was. I'd noticed Nico at the library again that morning, sitting close enough to watch me but far enough to claim coincidence. I gave Rocco the basic story without too much detail. Told him about the bet and the kiss and the humiliation. Told him Nico had transferred here and was now trying to reconnect like nothing had happened. Rocco listened without interrupting, and his response was simple. He said I deserved way better than someone who would treat me like that. He said he wasn't worried because he could tell I wasn't interested in Nico at all. The next day, after our shared Thursday class, I was talking with Rocco outside the building about the upcoming exam. I saw Nico walking toward us from across the quad. His expression shifted when he saw Rocco standing close to me, laughing at something I'd said. Nico's smile faltered, and something that looked like jealousy crossed his face before he caught himself. The next afternoon, Nico texted asking if I wanted to study together for the biology exam. When I said I already had a study group, he asked directly if Rocco and I were dating. He tried to sound casual, but I could read the tension in his words. I texted back that we were seeing each other casually. Nothing too serious. I watched the 3 dots appear and disappear several times before his response finally came through saying that was cool and he hoped I was happy. I could picture him staring at his phone, processing this new information with visible discomfort, realizing he wasn't the only option anymore. A few days later, Nico texted asking if I wanted to come to a small gathering at his apartment that Friday. He mentioned some mutual friends from high school would be there, people who'd also ended up at our university. I almost said no automatically, but then he mentioned Faye would be coming. I'd run into Faye at the campus bookstore a few weeks back, and we'd grabbed coffee together. She was different from how I remembered her in high school, more genuine and less concerned with what everyone else thought. We'd talked for 2 hours about our classes and our plans after graduation, and I'd actually enjoyed it. So I texted back saying I'd stop by for a bit. Friday evening, I showed up at Nico's apartment around 8. The place was small but clean, with mismatched furniture that looked like it came from different thrift stores. About 15 people were scattered around the living room and kitchen, most of them faces I recognized from high school, but hadn't really kept in touch with. Nico opened the door and his whole face lit up when he saw me. He touched my arm lightly as I walked past him into the apartment, guiding me toward where everyone was gathered. I moved away from his hand smoothly and headed straight for where Faye was standing by the kitchen counter. Faye hugged me and immediately started telling me about her disastrous chemistry lab from earlier that week. We fell into easy conversation while Nico hovered nearby, clearly waiting for an opening to join us. Every time there was a pause in our discussion, he'd try to steer the conversation towards something that included him, or suggest we all move to the couch where there was more room. I kept turning back to Faye, asking her another question or bringing up a new topic. After about 20 minutes of this, Nico gave up and went to talk to some guys near the TV. I grabbed a soda from the cooler and settled onto the arm of the couch next to Faye. We talked about her roommate drama and my research project and the terrible dining hall food. Other people drifted in and out of our conversation. Nico kept glancing over at me from across the room. At one point, he brought over a bowl of chips and set it on the coffee table right in front of where I was sitting, using it as an excuse to ask if I was having a good time. I told him it was nice seeing everyone again, and turned back to Faye before he could continue. Around 9:30, Faye touched my elbow and nodded toward the small balcony off the living room. We stepped outside into the cool night air. The balcony was barely big enough for 2 people, with a rusty metal railing and a view of the parking lot. Faye leaned against the railing and looked at me carefully. She said she'd heard about what happened at that party senior year. My stomach tightened, but I kept my expression neutral. She continued quickly, explaining she wasn't there that night, but she'd heard the story later from someone else. She said she thought it was really cruel what Nico and his friends did. I took a sip of my soda to give myself a second before responding. Faye asked if I was okay being around him now, if it bothered me to see him at the school and come to his apartment. I appreciated that she asked directly instead of dancing around it. I told her I was completely fine, that I wasn't the same person I was in high school and he couldn't hurt me anymore. I explained that I'd built a whole new life here, and what happened back then didn't have power over me now. Faye studied my face like she was trying to determine if I was telling the truth or just being brave. I must have been convincing because she relaxed and said she was glad, that she'd been worried about bringing it up, but wanted to make sure I was okay. We talked for a few more minutes about other things, lighter topics, before heading back inside. The apartment felt warmer after the cool air outside. I noticed Nico watching us come back in, and within minutes he was making his way over. Someone had turned up the music and a few people were laughing loudly near the kitchen. Nico asked if he could talk to me for a minute and gestured back toward the balcony. Faye gave me a questioning look, but I nodded that it was fine. Nico and I stepped back outside. He closed the sliding door behind us, muffling the noise from the party. The balcony felt even smaller with him standing close to me. He leaned against the railing and ran his hand through his hair, a nervous gesture I remembered from high school. He said he knew we had a weird moment at that party senior year, and he wanted to clear the air about it. I stayed quiet, watching him, curious to see if he would actually acknowledge what he'd done or keep minimizing it. He shifted his weight from one foot to the other. He said everyone was drunk and stupid that night, and things got out of hand with his friends acting immature. I kept my expression neutral, giving him nothing. He continued, saying he felt bad about how it ended and he wished we could move past it, now that we were both more mature. I noticed he never actually said the words, "I'm sorry," or took direct responsibility for orchestrating the whole thing. Instead, he framed it like some mutual awkward situation that just happened to both of us, like we were both victims of his friend's behavior, rather than him being the one who planned it. He said we were different people now, and he hoped we could start fresh. I let the silence sit between us for a few seconds. Then I told him very calmly that I appreciated him bringing it up. I explained that I had moved past it completely, that I wasn't angry or hurt anymore. I said I'd grown a lot since then, and I hoped he had too. Relief washed over his face immediately. He stepped forward like he was going to hug me, arms already starting to lift. I took a smooth step back and suggested we head back inside to rejoin everyone. His arms dropped and he nodded quickly, trying to hide his disappointment. We went back into the apartment and I found Faye again. Nico stayed close for the rest of the night, always within view, always ready to jump into whatever conversation I was having. When I said I needed to leave around 11, he walked me to the door and asked if I'd want to hang out again soon, just the two of us. I gave him a non-committal smile and said maybe, then left before he could pin me down to specific plans. The next 2 weeks were intense. Nico texted me constantly, good morning messages and good night messages and random thoughts throughout the day. He asked me to study together, to grab coffee, to check out a new restaurant off campus. I responded to maybe 1 in every 5 texts. Always friendly but never encouraging. He started showing up at places he knew I'd be. I'd see him at the library during my usual study times, at the campus gym when I went for my morning run, at the student center between my classes. Leilani noticed immediately. She said he was clearly pursuing me hard, and she was impressed by how I was handling it without being mean or leading him on. The club we were both part of announced they were planning a weekend camping trip in the mountains. The president sent out a sign-up sheet during our Wednesday meeting. I added my name without thinking much about it. The next day, Nico texted asking if I was going on the trip. When I said yes, he said he'd just signed up too and suggested we could carpool together since we were going to the same place anyway. I texted back quickly that I was already riding with Leilani and some other friends. He sent back a thumbs-up emoji, but I could picture his face, the disappointment he was trying to hide. The camping trip was the second weekend of October. Leilani and I drove up with 2 other girls from the club, our car packed with sleeping bags and coolers and camping chairs. The campsite was beautiful, surrounded by tall pine trees with a clear stream running nearby. About 20 people from the club came on the trip. We spent Friday afternoon setting up tents and gathering firewood. Nico tried to partner with me for everything. When we were setting up the cooking area, he appeared next to me asking if I needed help arranging the camp stoves. When the group split up to gather firewood, he tried to join my team. Each time I smiled and included other people in whatever we were doing, turning every interaction into a group activity rather than giving him the private time he clearly wanted. Saturday, we went on a long hike up to a waterfall. Nico positioned himself right behind me on the trail, trying to start conversations about the scenery and our classes and random memories from high school. I kept turning to talk to the people around us, asking questions and making jokes that included everyone. Rocco was also on the trip. I'd been happy to see him when we arrived at the campsite Friday night. We'd been texting less frequently the past few weeks because he had midterms, but seeing him again reminded me why I enjoyed his company. He was easy to be around, no games or hidden agendas. During the hike, I made sure to spend visible time with him, laughing at his stories and walking next to him when the trail widened enough for 2 people side by side. I saw Nico watching us from behind. That night, we built a big campfire and everyone gathered around it. Someone brought marshmallows and chocolate and graham crackers for s'mores. The flames cast moving shadows across everyone's faces. We sat on logs and camping chairs arranged in a circle around the fire. Nico made sure to sit directly across from me where he could maintain eye contact. Around 9, someone suggested playing Truth or Dare. A few people groaned, but most seemed into it. Nico perked up immediately, sitting forward in his chair. The game started silly, with people getting dared to do ridiculous things like hop on one foot around the campfire or sing the alphabet backwards. When it was Nico's turn, he chose Truth. Someone asked if he had a crush on anyone here at the campsite. The energy around the fire shifted. People glanced at each other, suddenly more interested. Nico looked directly at me and said yes. He was interested in someone, but he wasn't sure if she felt the same way. Everyone's eyes moved between us. The tension was obvious. Leilani raised her eyebrows at me from across the fire. I kept my expression completely neutral and took a sip of my hot chocolate. The game continued, but the mood had changed. People kept sneaking looks at me and Nico. After about 20 minutes, I got up and said I was going to get more water. I walked over to the coolers we'd set up near the cars, away from the firelight. The night was cold and clear, stars visible in the sky above the trees. I was digging through the ice in the cooler when I heard footsteps behind me. Nico's voice said my name quietly. I turned around and he was standing a few feet away, hands in his jacket pockets. He said he was talking about me during the game. I'd figured that much. He stepped closer and said he knew we had history, but he'd really fallen for who I was now. He said he'd love a chance to take me on a real date, to see if we could be something more than just people who used to know each other in high school. His voice was sincere and his eyes were hopeful. I closed the cooler and stood up straight. I thanked him for being honest and told him I needed time to think about it. I kept my expression neutral, not encouraging but not cruel either. He nodded and said he understood, that he'd wait for my answer. We walked back to the campfire separately, him going first and me following a minute later. The week after the camping trip, I went to class, studied at the library, met up with friends for coffee, and did all my normal activities without thinking too much about what Nico had asked me. My phone buzzed Tuesday afternoon while I was reviewing notes for my psychology midterm. It was him asking if I'd had time to think about going on a date. I waited 3 hours before responding that I'd been swamped with midterms and barely had time to breathe. It was true, but it was also convenient. Wednesday evening, Leilani came back to our apartment after her shift at the campus bookstore and found me sitting on the couch with my laptop open to a study guide I wasn't actually reading. She dropped her bag by the door and asked what was going on with me. I told her I didn't know what to do about Nico. She sat down next to me and asked what I was leaning toward. I admitted part of me wanted to sit down with him and have a real conversation about what happened, get some kind of closure or understanding. But another part of me thought the best response was just continuing to live my life and letting the whole thing fade away naturally. She nodded and said both options made sense, but I needed to figure out which one would actually make me feel better versus which one I thought I was supposed to do. Thursday afternoon, Faye texted asking if I wanted to grab lunch at the student union. We met up around 1 and got sandwiches from the deli counter, then found a table by the windows overlooking the quad. She made small talk about her classes for a few minutes before bringing up what she really wanted to discuss. She said she could tell Nico really liked me, and he seemed different from how he was in high school, more genuine and less cocky. I asked her what she actually knew about his time at his other schools before he transferred here. She said she'd heard he partied way too much freshman year and stopped going to class, which tanked his grades and got him kicked out. She mentioned he had academic problems at his second school too, but she didn't know much about his personal life during that time. I thanked her for being honest and told her I was still figuring out how I felt about everything. That night I sat in bed scrolling through social media, clicking through profiles of mutual friends and people from high school who'd ended up at different colleges. I found Nico's page from his first university and went through his old posts and photos. Most of it was typical college stuff, parties and football games and late-night food runs. Then I found pictures of him with a girl who showed up repeatedly over several months freshman year, her arm around him, his hand on her waist, comments on posts calling each other cute couple names. I clicked over to her profile and scrolled back to that time period. The posts from when they were together were happy and full of inside jokes. Then there was a gap of a few weeks with nothing posted. After that, several posts about being tired of games and wanting someone genuine, about knowing your worth and not settling for people who take you for granted. The timeline matched up with right before Nico flunked out. I wondered if his pattern of not appreciating people until they were gone extended beyond just what he did to me. Friday after my economics class, Johnny caught up with me on the path heading toward the library. He said Nico had asked him what he thought Nico's chances were with me. I stopped walking and looked at him, waiting to hear what he'd said. Johnny told me he'd been honest with Nico, that I seemed happy with my life and not particularly interested in revisiting the past. Nico had apparently gotten defensive and insisted he was a different person now who genuinely cared about me. Johnny said he didn't know what I was planning to do, but he wanted me to know that Nico was asking around and trying to figure out where he stood. I thanked Johnny for the heads up and told him I appreciated him being real with Nico instead of just telling him what he wanted to hear. Saturday night, there was a house party off campus that most of our friend group was going to. I showed up around 10 with Leilani and some other girls from our dorm. The house was packed with people, music loud enough that you had to lean close to hear anyone talking. I grabbed a drink from the kitchen and made my way through the crowded living room. That's when I saw Nico standing near the back door talking to a girl I recognized from high school who'd also transferred to our university. She was laughing at something he said, clearly interested in him, touching his arm while they talked. I watched from across the room to see how he'd respond. He was friendly and smiling, but his eyes kept moving around the room like he was looking for someone. When he spotted me watching, his whole posture changed. He said something to the girl and excused himself, then worked his way through the crowd toward where I was standing with a group of friends. He came up next to me and asked if I was having fun. I said the party was good and asked how he was doing. He made small talk for a minute before mentioning he'd been thinking about my answer to his date request. I looked at him and told him honestly that I wasn't sure dating was a good idea, given our history. His face fell and he asked if I was ever going to forgive him for what happened in high school, saying he thought we'd moved past it. I corrected him gently, explaining that I had forgiven him, but forgiveness didn't mean forgetting or pretending it didn't matter. Something shifted in his expression then, like he was actually hearing what I was saying for the first time, instead of just waiting for his turn to talk. He looked at me with this mix of understanding and regret that I'd never seen on his face before. He asked if there was anything he could do to prove he'd changed, and that he was serious about wanting a real chance with me. I told him the problem wasn't about proving anything. I explained that I'd built a whole new life here, worked hard to become someone confident and happy, and I wasn't interested in bringing someone into it who reminded me of the worst moment of my old life. Nico was quiet for a moment, processing what I'd said. Then he asked if I was saying there was no chance at all, ever. I thought carefully before responding because I wanted to be honest without being cruel. I told him I was saying I was happy with my life exactly as it is right now. He nodded slowly, looking more defeated than I'd ever seen him, and walked away without his usual confident swagger. Over the next few days, my phone stayed quiet. No good morning texts from Nico, no random memes or questions about homework. I noticed he wasn't at the library during my usual study times, wasn't at the coffee shop when I grabbed my afternoon caffeine. Tuesday evening, Leilani asked if something had happened with Nico, because she hadn't seen him around lately. I explained our conversation at the party, how I'd been honest about not wanting to date him. She said she was proud of me for being honest instead of stringing him along or being cruel just because I could be. Wednesday afternoon, Rocco found me after class and asked if I wanted to get dinner that weekend, like an actual official date instead of just casual hanging out. I said yes without hesitating. Saturday night, he picked me up and we drove to a nice Italian restaurant off campus, the kind with cloth napkins and candles on the tables. We sat across from each other and talked about everything, our classes and our families and our plans after graduation. He told me he thought I was smart and funny and beautiful. I believed him because he'd never given me reason not to, never played games or made me question if he meant what he said. Being with him felt completely different from anything I'd felt with Nico, because Rocco had liked me from the start without needing to lose me first to realize my value. I walked into the library 3 days later to grab a book I'd reserved, and there was Nico at one of the study tables near the windows. He looked up when I passed, and something about his expression was different from all the other times I'd seen him lately. He stood up and came over, hands in his pockets. No confident swagger or calculated charm. He asked how I'd been, and his voice sounded normal, like he was actually asking instead of trying to start something. I said I'd been good, busy with classes and everything. He nodded and said he'd been thinking about what I said at the party, about how I wasn't interested in bringing someone into my life who reminded me of the worst moment of my old life. He paused and looked at me directly, and I could see he was trying to find the right words. He said he never really understood before how much that night affected me, and he was sorry for minimizing it when he tried to apologize. I stood there holding my book, surprised by how genuine he sounded. This wasn't the Nico who made excuses or blamed being drunk or called it a weird moment. This was someone actually taking responsibility. I told him I appreciated him saying that, and I meant it. He shifted his weight and said there was more he wanted to tell me if I had a minute. I glanced at my phone, saw I had time before my next class, and said, okay. We sat down at his table and he started talking about how he'd been seeing a therapist since last semester, when his academic probation got serious. He said they'd been working on his pattern of not appreciating people until they were gone, and he was starting to see how he did that with his ex-girlfriend at his old school, and now with me. He explained that his ex had tried to talk to him about their relationship problems for months, but he'd brushed her off because he thought she'd always be there. Then she broke up with him right before he flunked out and he lost everything at once. He said his therapist helped him realize he does the same thing with friendships and family, always assuming people will stick around no matter how he treats them. I watched him talk, noticing how different he seemed from the guy who'd approached me at that first party. This version of Nico was uncomfortable and honest, not performing or trying to charm me. I told him I appreciated him being vulnerable and actually taking responsibility instead of making excuses. He looked relieved that I wasn't shutting him down completely. He asked if we could at least be friends, maybe grab coffee sometimes or just be normal when we saw each other around campus. I thought about it for a moment, trying to figure out what I actually wanted. I told him maybe eventually, but I needed more space right now. He nodded and said he understood, and he wouldn't push or keep showing up everywhere I went. We stood up and he thanked me for listening, then went back to his studying while I checked out my book and left. The next few weeks passed with barely any contact between Nico and me. He kept his word about giving me space. I didn't see him at my usual coffee shop or study spots, didn't get random texts about homework or campus events. It felt strange at first, like something was missing from my routine, but then I realized I'd gotten used to his constant presence without noticing. Without that underlying tension of avoiding him or managing his attempts to get close, I felt lighter somehow. Rocco and I were getting more serious, going on actual dates instead of just casual hangouts, talking about our plans for after graduation, making plans for spring break together. I was genuinely happy without any of the anxiety or second guessing I'd felt in high school when I'd liked Nico. Leilani noticed the change when we were getting ready to go out one Friday night. She said I seemed lighter lately, like I'd finally let go of something I didn't realize I was still carrying. I asked what she meant, and she explained that for months I'd been carrying this awareness of Nico, this need to maintain my distance and protect myself. Now I just seemed free of it, like it wasn't taking up space in my head anymore. I realized she was right. I'd stopped thinking about Nico constantly, stopped planning how to avoid him or what I'd say if he approached me. He'd become background noise instead of the main event. Faye grabbed me after our shared psychology class the following week and pulled me aside in the hallway. She said she'd heard through mutual friends that Nico had been keeping to himself more, focusing on his grades after almost losing his spot at this school too. Apparently, his advisor had given him a serious warning about his GPA, and he'd actually started showing up to all his classes and doing the work. She said he seemed different when she'd run into him at the student center, less cocky and more genuine, more willing to admit when he didn't understand something instead of pretending he knew everything. She wondered out loud if losing his chance with me actually taught him something real. I told her I hoped so, for his sake, but it wasn't really my concern anymore. She looked at me with this knowing smile and said that was exactly the right answer. She said when someone becomes not your concern anymore, that's when you know you've really moved on. I thought about that as I walked to my next class, realizing she was absolutely right. I didn't need Nico to suffer or fail. I didn't need him to pine after me forever. I just needed him to be irrelevant to my life, and he finally was. The club meeting that Thursday was focused on our semester projects, and Nico was scheduled to present his research on community development initiatives. I'll admit I was curious to see what he'd put together, remembering how he'd joined this club just to be around me and hadn't seemed interested in the actual work. He stood up at the front of the room with his laptop connected to the projector, and I prepared myself for something half done or poorly researched. Instead, he delivered a really thoughtful presentation about affordable housing programs in college towns, with actual data and case studies and practical suggestions for our campus community. He'd clearly spent serious time on this project, and his passion for the topic seemed genuine. When he finished, several people asked questions, and he answered them confidently without being arrogant about it. After the meeting ended, I walked over to where he was packing up his materials. I told him his presentation was really good, that I was impressed by how much work he'd put into it. He looked up and smiled, and it was different from any smile I'd seen on his face before. It seemed genuinely happy for the compliment rather than seeing it as an opening to push for more. He thanked me and said the project had actually made him think about what he wanted to do after graduation, maybe something in urban planning or community development. We chatted briefly about the research he'd done and the organizations he'd contacted. It felt almost normal, like we could maybe be casual acquaintances someday who could have a conversation without all the weight of our history crushing every interaction. Johnny found me in the campus dining hall the next week while I was grabbing lunch between classes. He sat down across from me with his tray and asked if I'd noticed that Nico seemed different lately. I said I'd noticed he was keeping to himself more and seemed more focused on the school. Johnny nodded and said Nico had been a better friend lately too, more reliable and less self-centered, actually showing up when he said he would instead of flaking for something better. He said Nico had apologized to him for being a bad friend freshman and sophomore year, for only calling when he needed something or wanted to party. Johnny told me he thought getting rejected by me was a wake-up call that Nico needed, someone finally holding him accountable for his behavior instead of just going along with whatever he wanted. I appreciated Johnny saying that, but I told him I was glad Nico was growing and becoming a better person. But his growth journey wasn't my responsibility or my concern. Johnny agreed immediately and said he wasn't trying to suggest I should give Nico another chance or anything like that. He just wanted me to know that my decision to protect yourself and maintain your boundaries had actually helped more people than just me. Their whole friend group had started being more honest with each other and calling out bad behavior instead of laughing it off. Rocco met some of my high school friends the following weekend when Faye threw a party at her apartment. I'd been nervous about mixing my high school past with my college present, but Rocco fit in perfectly with everyone. He was friendly and funny, asked good questions, seemed genuinely interested in getting to know the people who were important to me. Faye pulled me aside while Rocco was deep in conversation with some other people about engineering programs. She said she could see why I was with him instead of giving Nico another chance. She said Rocco treated me like I was valuable because I am, not because he finally realized it after losing me. She said there was something different about being with someone who recognized your worth from the beginning, who didn't need to lose you to understand what they had. I hugged her and told her I appreciated her understanding and support of my choice. She said she'd always support me choosing myself and my happiness over nostalgia or giving someone another chance they didn't earn. Later that night, Rocco told me he really liked my friends, and he was glad I'd introduced him to that part of my life. I realized I'd been protecting these two parts of my world from each other, worried that bringing them together would somehow force me to confront my past in ways I wasn't ready for. But it felt good to integrate them, to show Rocco where I came from, while also showing my old friends who I'd become. Near the end of the semester, I went to a party at one of the bigger houses off campus with Leilani and some other friends. The place was packed with people from various friend groups and classes. Music loud enough that you had to lean in close to hear anyone talking. I was standing in the kitchen getting a drink when I looked across the room and saw Nico with the girl from our high school he'd been talking to at that party weeks earlier. They were clearly together now, standing close with his arm around her waist, both of them laughing at something someone had said. She looked happy and comfortable with him, and he looked relaxed in a way I'd never seen when he was pursuing me. He caught my eye across the room, and for a second I thought it might be awkward, but he just gave me a small wave. I waved back, and that was it. No tension or awkwardness or unspoken history hanging heavy between us. Just two people who used to know each other better, acknowledging each other's presence at the same party. I turned back to my conversation with Leilani, and Nico became just another person in the crowded room. Leilani asked me later that night when we were walking back to our apartment if I was bothered by Nico having a girlfriend. I thought about it. Really examined my feelings to see if there was any jealousy or regret or sadness hiding underneath. I realized I genuinely didn't care at all. I told Leilani I hoped he treated this girl better than he treated me or his ex, and I meant it sincerely. I didn't hope it because I was being noble or taking the high road. I hoped it because I wanted him to be a better person, who didn't hurt people the way he'd hurt me. Leilani said that's how she knew I'd really moved on, when I could wish him well without needing anything from him. She said some people move on by staying angry or bitter, using their resentment as armor. But really, moving on meant reaching a point where the person just didn't matter to your emotional landscape anymore. They became neutral, neither good nor bad, just someone who existed in the world separate from you. As finals approached, I threw myself into studying and preparing for exams. I spent long hours in the library with my study group, made detailed outlines for my papers, met with professors during office hours to clarify concepts I didn't fully understand. Rocco and I studied together sometimes, taking breaks to get coffee or go for walks when our brains needed rest. I hung out with Leilani and our other friends, went to the gym to burn off stress, maintained my routines and friendships and relationship. Nico became just another person I occasionally saw around campus. I'd spot him in the library sometimes or pass him on the quad between classes and we'd nod or say hi if we made eye contact. The power I'd felt from keeping him at a distance, from watching him want something he couldn't have, transformed into something better, complete indifference. He was no longer the person who hurt me or the person pursuing me or even the person I was actively avoiding. He was just Nico, someone I used to know, someone who existed in my world but didn't affect it. That felt like the real victory, better than any revenge I could have planned. Winter break came and I went back to my hometown for 3 weeks. My parents were happy to see me and wanted to hear about school and my classes and my friends. I told them about my good grades and the clubs I was in and how much I loved living with Leilani. They asked if I was dating anyone and I mentioned Rocco casually, said we'd been seeing each other for a few months and it was going well. My mom smiled and said I seemed really happy. Different from how I'd been that last summer before college when I barely left my room. I ran into some old high school friends at the grocery store on my second day home. They recognized me immediately and came over to say hi, asking how college was treating me. I told them it was great, that I loved my school and had made good friends. One of them asked if I'd heard that Nico transferred there, and I said yeah. I'd seen him around campus a few times. They looked at me like they were waiting for more, like they expected me to be upset or angry or hurt. I just shrugged and said we weren't really close anymore, that we ran in different circles now. They seemed surprised by how casual I was about it, exchanging glances with each other like they couldn't believe I wasn't more bothered. Later that night, I realized they still saw me as the girl who got humiliated at that party, the one who cried and hid and let what Nico did define her whole summer. They had no idea that girl didn't exist anymore, that I'd spent 3 years becoming someone completely different. It felt strange knowing they were still stuck in that old version of me while I'd moved so far past it. Spring semester started in January, and I threw myself back into my routine. Classes were harder this term, but I liked the challenge. Rocco and I fell back into our pattern of studying together and getting coffee between classes. Leilani and I hosted a small party at our apartment to celebrate the new semester and invited our closest friends. I saw Nico around campus more often as the weeks went by. He was always with his girlfriend, the girl from our high school he'd been seeing since fall. They walked to class together holding hands, sat close in the library studying, got lunch at the dining hall at the same table every day. I noticed how he treated her with obvious care and attention, opening doors for her and carrying her backpack and listening when she talked. He looked at her the way I used to wish he'd look at me. Part of me wondered briefly if he would have treated me that way if I'd given him a chance back in the fall, if I'd been willing to overlook what he did in high school and start fresh. But mostly I just felt glad I'd trusted my instincts and protected myself. Whatever version of Nico existed now, the one who was apparently a good boyfriend to this girl, didn't change what he'd done to me or make it okay. I'd made the right choice, keeping him at a distance. Rocco and I were studying in my apartment one night in late February when he put down his textbook and looked at me seriously. He said he needed to tell me something and he hoped it wasn't too soon, but he couldn't keep it to himself anymore. My heart started beating faster and I put down my own book. He said he was falling in love with me, that he'd been feeling it for weeks, but wanted to be sure before he said anything. He said being with me made him happier than he'd been in a long time, and he wanted me to know how he felt. I sat there for a second processing what he'd just said, and realized I felt exactly the same way about him. Our relationship had been so different from anything I'd experienced before, built on actual respect and genuine affection from the very beginning. There were no games or tests or proving myself worthy of his attention. He liked me for who I was and showed it consistently through his actions. I told him I loved him too, and watching his face light up made me feel completely certain I'd said the right thing. He pulled me close and kissed me, and it felt nothing like that kiss with Nico at the party years ago. This one was real and honest, and exactly what I wanted. We stayed up late that night talking about our future, making plans for the summer and senior year, imagining what might come after graduation. Everything felt right and easy and good. The campus activities board put on a big spring festival in March with food trucks and live music and games set up all over the quad. I went with Leilani and some other friends, wandering between the different booths and eating too much fried food. Rocco was working a shift at his campus job but planned to meet us later. I was waiting in line for lemonade when someone tapped my shoulder. I turned around and saw a pretty brunette girl I didn't recognize smiling at me. She introduced herself as Nico's girlfriend and said she'd heard we knew each other from high school. I was surprised but recovered quickly and introduced myself properly. She was sweet and friendly, asking about my major and what classes I was taking this semester. We chatted for a few minutes about campus life and professors we both had. She mentioned she was thinking about joining one of the clubs I was in and asked if I'd recommend it. I told her honestly that I loved it and she should definitely come to the next meeting. I could tell from the way she brought up high school that Nico had probably told her something about our history, but she didn't ask any direct questions, and I didn't volunteer any information. We talked about normal things like homework and the festival and plans for summer break. After a few minutes, she said it was nice meeting me and headed back toward where Nico was waiting by one of the food trucks. I watched them walk away together and felt completely neutral about the whole interaction. She seemed nice, and I hoped things worked out well for her. Johnny found me at the library a week later while I was studying for a big exam. He sat down across from me and asked if we could talk for a minute. I closed my textbook and said sure. He seemed a little uncomfortable, like he wasn't sure how to start. Finally, he said, "Nico talks about me sometimes when they hang out. Not in a weird way, but just mentioning me as someone who taught him an important lesson." Johnny said Nico credits not getting a chance with me as the push he needed to actually change his behavior and become a better person. He said Nico tells people I was right to reject him and he deserved it for what he did. I listened to all this, and then told Johnny I appreciated him sharing that information. I said I was glad Nico learned something from the experience and seemed to be growing up, but I also made it clear that I didn't reject Nico to teach him a lesson or help him become better. I did it to protect myself from someone who had hurt me badly, and showed no real understanding of why that mattered. If Nico's growth was a side effect of my self-protection, that was fine, but it wasn't my goal or my responsibility. Johnny nodded and said he understood completely. He said he respected how I handled everything, and he was sorry again for his part in what happened at that party. We talked for a few more minutes about other things, and then he left me to study. As spring semester moved forward, I barely thought about Nico except when I occasionally saw him around campus. My days were full of good things that had nothing to do with him. Rocco and I were solid and happy, spending most of our free time together and making plans for our future. My friendships with Leilani and my other close friends felt strong and supportive. My grades were good, and I was doing well in all my classes. I had genuine confidence now that came from within myself, not from anyone else's validation or approval. The girl who cried in her car after that party felt like a completely different person, someone I used to be but couldn't fully remember being. I'd worked so hard to build this new version of myself, and I was proud of who I'd become. Sometimes I'd catch a glimpse of Nico across the quad or in the dining hall and feel absolutely nothing. No anger, no hurt, no curiosity about what might have been. He was just another student at my school, someone who existed in my world but didn't affect it in any meaningful way. That indifference felt like the ultimate victory, better than any revenge I could have planned or executed. He didn't matter to me anymore, and that was exactly how I wanted it. Leilani and I were having dinner at our apartment one night in April, when she brought up how much we'd both grown during our time in college. She talked about coming here as a freshman, feeling lost and unsure of herself, and how different she felt now as we approached senior year. I mentioned how handling the Nico situation taught me that I don't owe anyone access to me, even if they claim they've changed or want another chance. I said learning to set that boundary clearly and stick to it without guilt was one of the most important lessons I'd learned. Leilani got quiet for a second and then said, watching me do that helped her set boundaries in her own life. She said seeing me refuse to compromise my self-respect or let someone back in just because they wanted, it showed her she could do the same thing. She mentioned a guy she'd been seeing freshman year who treated her badly and how she used to make excuses for him and give him chance after chance. But after watching how I handled Nico, she realized she deserved better and ended things. I felt proud hearing that my experience could help someone else, especially someone I cared about as much as Leilani. We talked for hours that night about growth and change and becoming the people we wanted to be. The club I was active in held an awards ceremony near the end of the school year to recognize members who'd contributed the most. I knew I was getting an award because the president had told me ahead of time, but I was surprised to see Nico's name on the list too. The ceremony was nice, held in one of the campus event spaces with refreshments and a small crowd of members and their friends. When they called my name, I went up and was accepted my award, thanking everyone for a great year. A few awards later, they called Nico's name, and he went up looking genuinely pleased. After the ceremony ended, people mingled and congratulated each other. Nico came over to where I was standing with some friends and congratulated me on my award. I congratulated him back, and we stood there for a moment in comfortable silence. Then he said he was genuinely glad we ended up at the same school because it forced him to grow up and face what he'd done. He said he knew I didn't owe him anything, but he wanted me to know he appreciated how I handled everything. I thanked him for saying that and told him I was glad things seemed to be going well for him. We talked for another minute about summer plans and then went our separate ways. It felt like a good ending to that chapter, polite and respectful without any lingering tension. Rocco and I made plans to stay in the same city over the summer instead of going home. We both found internships in our fields and decided to get an apartment together for senior year. Sitting in his dorm room looking at apartment listings online, I thought about how much my life had changed since that awful night at the party. I realized Nico was right about one thing when he said running into me at college was crazy, but not in the way he meant it. It was crazy because it showed me how much I'd grown and how little power he had over me anymore. Seeing him around campus all year, watching him try so hard to get close to me and then finally accepting that it wasn't going to happen, proved to me that I was strong enough to protect myself. I didn't need revenge or closure or an apology to move forward. I just needed to trust myself and build a life I was proud of. Rocco asked what I was thinking about, and I told him I was just happy, that everything felt right. He smiled and pulled me close, and we went back to looking at apartments, planning our future together. Faye invited me to coffee one afternoon in early May. We sat outside at a campus cafe enjoying the warm weather and catching up on end-of-semester stress. She brought up Nico out of nowhere, saying she'd been thinking about how I handled the whole situation with him. She said she was impressed by the grace and strength I showed throughout everything. A lot of people would have either given him another chance out of nostalgia for high school or been openly cruel to him out of revenge for what he did. But I did neither of those things. I just protected myself while letting him be responsible for his own growth. I thought about what she said and realized she was right. I could have made things harder for Nico if I'd wanted to. Could have told everyone at the school what he did, or confronted him publicly, or tried to turn mutual friends against him. But that wouldn't have made me feel better, or changed what happened. I told Faye I just did what felt right for me, which was setting clear boundaries and sticking to them without being unnecessarily cruel. She said that took real maturity, and she admired how I handled it. We finished our coffee and walked back across campus together, and I felt grateful to have friends who understood and supported the choices I'd made. The semester wound down through finals and last-minute projects, and on the final day of classes, I walked across campus with Leilani after turning in my last paper. We stopped at the coffee shop to celebrate being done, and while we waited in line, I saw Nico and his girlfriend through the window. They were walking together on the path outside, both laughing at something on his phone, her hand tucked into his arm. I watched them for a moment and felt absolutely nothing. Not satisfaction that he'd moved on, not sadness that we never happened, not even the faint vindication I might have expected. Just complete neutrality, like watching two strangers pass by. Leilani followed my gaze and asked if I was okay. I told her I was fine, genuinely fine, and she smiled and said that was the best possible outcome. I agreed completely because it was true. The fact that I could see him happy with someone else and feel nothing meant I'd actually let go of everything that happened between us. Summer break started a week later, and Rocco and I both stayed in town for internships in our fields. I worked at an engineering firm downtown while he did research at a lab on campus, and we fell into an easy routine of meeting for dinner after work and spending weekends exploring the city together. My internship was challenging and rewarding, giving me real experience in the career I'd been working toward for 3 years. I threw myself into the projects they assigned me, learning from the senior engineers and proving I could handle professional responsibilities. Rocco's research was going well too, and we'd spend evenings comparing notes about our days, both excited about our futures. One night in late July, someone from high school commented on an old photo on social media, asking if I'd heard Nico transferred to my university. I stared at the message for a moment, trying to remember what he was even doing lately. It took me several seconds to recall that he was dating someone and doing better in his classes. The fact that I had to actively think about it, that he wasn't just present in my mind anymore, made me realize I'd truly moved on. He'd become background noise in my life, someone I occasionally saw around campus, but rarely thought about otherwise. Rocco and I found an apartment together for senior year, a small 2-bedroom place a few blocks from campus with big windows and enough space for both of us to study. We spent a weekend in August moving our stuff in, arranging furniture, hanging pictures, making the place feel like ours. Standing in our living room after we'd finished unpacking, I looked around at the life I'd built and felt proud of myself. This wasn't about proving anything to anyone anymore. This was about knowing my worth and building a life that reflected it. I wasn't the girl who needed validation from someone who'd hurt her. I was the woman who knew what she deserved and refused to settle for less than genuine love and respect from the start. Rocco came up behind me and wrapped his arms around my waist, asking what I was thinking about. I told him I was just happy, and he kissed my temple and said he was happy too. Senior year started in September, with the familiar rush of new classes and reconnecting with friends after summer break. I saw Nico occasionally around campus, usually with his girlfriend, and we'd achieved this comfortable acquaintance where we could nod politely in passing without any underlying tension. Sometimes we'd exchange brief small talk if we ended up in the same place, asking about classes or mentioning campus events, but it never went deeper than surface-level pleasantries. It was the best possible resolution for us. Not friendship, but not enemies either. Just two people who used to know each other better and had moved on to separate lives. I'd see them studying together in the library or getting coffee between classes, and it didn't bother me at all. They seemed good together, and I was genuinely doing well in my own life, so there was no reason for tension or awkwardness anymore. Johnny found me at the campus center one afternoon in early October and asked if we could talk for a minute. We sat down at one of the tables outside, and he told me he was grateful for how I'd handled everything with Nico. He said watching me set boundaries and stick to them had helped their whole friend group mature and treat people better. Several of them had reached out to people they'd hurt in high school to apologize after seeing Nico face real consequences for his actions. Johnny himself had apologized to 3 different people for things he did senior year, including the girl he'd dated briefly and then ghosted without explanation. He said seeing someone actually hold Nico accountable instead of just forgiving him or getting revenge made them all realize they needed to be better. I told him I appreciated him saying that, but I hadn't done it to teach anyone a lesson. I'd just protected myself and let Nico be responsible for his own growth. Johnny nodded and said that's exactly why it worked, because it was authentic and not performative. The party in late October was at someone's off-campus house, packed with people from various friend groups all mixing together. I was there with Leilani and some other friends, drinking and dancing and having a good time. At some point, someone brought up high school stories, and a guy I didn't know well started telling the story about a bet where someone convinced a girl to confess her feelings as a joke. My stomach dropped for a second, that old familiar anxiety starting to creep in, but before I could decide how to handle it, Nico spoke up from across the room. He said that was the worst thing he'd ever done to someone, and he'd spent years trying to be better because of it. He didn't mention my name or point me out, but he took full responsibility without minimizing what happened or making excuses. He said he was cruel and wrong, and humiliating someone like that for entertainment was something he'd always regret. The room got quiet for a moment, and then someone changed the subject to a different story. I caught Nico's eye across the crowd and gave him a small nod of acknowledgement. Later that night, I found Nico outside on the back porch getting some air. I walked over and thanked him for what he'd said inside. He turned to look at me and said he meant every word of it. Humiliating me was cruel and wrong, and he was genuinely sorry for what he did. Not sorry that I wouldn't give him another chance, not sorry that it didn't work out between us, but sorry for hurting me in the first place. I told him I appreciated the apology, and I could see he was different now from who he was in high school. We didn't need to be friends, probably never would be, but I was glad he was growing into a better person. He asked if I was happy, and I told him yes, I really was. He smiled and said good, that's what mattered. We stood there for another minute in comfortable silence, then went back inside to rejoin our separate groups of friends. As senior year continued through fall and into winter, I focused on my relationship with Rocco, my friendships with Leilani and the others, and my future plans after graduation. I applied to graduate programs and entry-level positions in my field, updated my resume, went to career fairs and networking events. The Nico situation became just a small chapter in my larger college story, not the defining narrative I'd once feared it would be, just one of many experiences that shaped who I became. I'd learned to set boundaries, to trust my instincts, to know my worth and not compromise it for anyone. Those lessons served me well in other areas of my life too, helping me navigate difficult conversations with professors, stand up for myself in group projects, make choices that aligned with my values even when they weren't easy. Spring semester brought warmer weather and a sense of things coming to an end. Rocco and I took walks around campus in the evenings, talking about where we'd end up after graduation and how we'd make long-distance work if we had to. One night in April, he stopped walking and turned to face me, looking nervous in a way I'd never seen him before. He told me he loved me and wanted to spend his life with me, and then he pulled out a ring and asked me to marry him. I said yes immediately, not even needing to think about it, because being with him felt right in a way nothing else ever had. We celebrated with Leilani and my other friends that weekend. everyone excited and happy for us. As I sat surrounded by people who loved and supported me, I thought about how different my life could have been if I'd given Nico another chance out of nostalgia or insecurity, or some misguided belief that I owed him something. I was so grateful I'd trusted myself and waited for someone who valued me from the beginning, who never made me question whether I was worth loving. Graduation day arrived in May with perfect weather, sunny and warm with a light breeze. I sat with my class in the folding chairs on the lawn, waiting for my name to be called, feeling proud of everything I'd accomplished over 4 years. After the ceremony ended, I found my family and took pictures, then wandered around saying goodbye to classmates and professors. Across the crowd, I saw Nico with his girlfriend and his family, all of them smiling and taking photos too. He caught my eye and I waved back, both of us genuinely friendly. There was no lingering tension or unfinished business between us, no what-ifs or regrets, just two people who knew each other once and learned their separate lessons and moved on to build good lives. That was the ending I needed, and it was perfect. After the ceremony ended and everyone started moving toward the parking lots with their families, I saw Nico walking toward me through the crowd. His girlfriend was talking to her parents a few yards away, and he had that look on his face that meant he wanted to say something important. I stopped and waited while he approached, my diploma tucked under my arm, Rocco standing beside me with his hand on my back. Nico congratulated me and said he was moving to Seattle for a job, leaving in 2 weeks, probably wouldn't be back this way for a long time. He thanked me for teaching him that actions have consequences and that some things can't be undone just because you want them to be, and his voice was steady and genuine without any of the charm he used to hide behind. I told him I hoped he had a great life out there, and I meant it completely. No bitterness or lingering hurt, just honest hope that he'd be better to the people he met next. He nodded and shook Rocco's hand and walked back to his girlfriend. And that was it. The final conversation we'd probably ever have. Later that afternoon, Leilani and I sat on the steps outside our apartment building with iced coffee, watching people load moving trucks up and down the street. She brought up the Nico situation without me asking. Said it was the first time she'd ever seen me truly stand up for myself. Really set a boundary and stick to it no matter how much pressure someone put on me. She told me that watching me refuse to settle for less than I deserved, watching me choose myself over nostalgia or guilt or the easier path, inspired her to do the same thing in her own relationships. I felt proud hearing that. Knowing my choice to protect myself ended up being an example for someone I loved. Proof that standing firm in your worth can matter beyond just your own life. The next few days I spent packing up my apartment, wrapping dishes in newspaper, and filling boxes with books and clothes, preparing for the move to the city where Rocco and I had both found jobs. I kept thinking about the girl who cried in her car after that party 4 years ago, the one who thought she'd never trust anyone again, never feel confident or wanted or safe. I wished I could go back and tell her she'd be okay, that she'd become strong and sure of herself and loved by someone who deserved her from the very beginning. That revenge isn't about hurting the person who hurt you or making them suffer the way you suffered. Sometimes it's just living well and refusing to let them matter, building a life so good that what they did becomes irrelevant. Rocco and I loaded the last boxes into his car on a sunny morning in late May, the campus mostly empty now, except for summer students and maintenance workers. We drove away together through streets I'd walked for 4 years, past buildings where I'd studied and made friends and became someone new. I realized as we merged onto the highway that I barely remembered what it felt like to want Nico's approval, to care whether he thought I was pretty or interesting or worth his time. The best revenge wasn't making him want me or punishing him for what he did or teaching him some lesson he needed to learn. It was becoming someone who knew her worth so deeply, so completely, that his opinion became totally irrelevant, just background noise in a life filled with real love and genuine respect. That was the victory I needed, and it was mine forever. Something no one could take away or diminish or make me doubt.